everyone. My name is Syuzi Pakhchyan. I am now the grandmother of fashion and technology. I'm incredibly proud to have that new title. I've been actually working in fashion and technology for the last 8 years. I began working in that space while I was a graduate student at Art Center College of Design. And back then, fashion and technology, or the intersection of and the exploration of, was quite different than what it is right now. All the research I did in my graduate work, I actually transformed into a book. It's called Fashioning Tech. It was one of the first DIY books on how to basically sew circuits together. And from that point on, I really became immersed in a really amazing, rich community of designers, artists, makers, and tinkers who are all trying to figure out, and I think they're still trying to figure out, like, how can we and why do we want to actually put technology onto the spaces of our bodies? I often hearken it to like the homebrew computer club, but instead of happening in one isolated area, as in Silicon Valley, it was actually happening globally. We were a very tight-knit group. We all traveled everywhere, but essentially because of platforms such as Instructables and the ability for us to share online, to share our knowledge, to share our experiments, we continue to grow and we continue to nurture each other and enable us at a time when industry wasn't supporting our lives and paying attention to us to actually do work. So nowadays, especially in the last 2 years, I predominantly work in industry, and I'm trained as a user experience designer. So most of my work for small companies, startups, all the way to bigger companies that I've worked for really revolves around trying to figure out how to make wearables desirable. And by desirable, I mean, of course, on the aesthetic end, how to make it wearable, how to make it beautiful, but also on the little bit more on the experience end and how to actually make these devices that we are now wearing on our bodies much more meaningful to our lives. And so today, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the trends and the themes that I see happening across industry, and talk about the needs they're actually serving in us, because I think those needs are real. So I don't think wearables are a fad, as a lot of people like to say. I think they are actually real because they're meeting general user needs. So quickly going through them, it's the whole need to measure myself, to document my days, augment my body, allow me to express who I am, and alert me with what matters most, as well as unlock my world. So the most common wearable that has really predominated in the market, of course, are activity trackers. So this need to constantly track our lives, to have data support us, is really the need for us to improve ourselves, to make ourselves better, to quantify our days. And this stems from the fact that we have habits, we have behavioral patterns that we don't necessarily understand ourselves, and over time that we can come to understand. A lot of these activity trackers are very good at making us mindful. I've stopped wearing them now, but I would wear them pretty continuously for a while, and I became mindful that I was the most inactive active person I knew, because I considered myself an active person, but when I looked at my data, I realized that I sit 12 hours a day in front of a screen, and because of the likes of Uber and all the lunch and dinner delivery services, I actually walk 300 steps a day. So you do become mindful of the fact that you are a very inactive, active person, but what we're sort of lacking right now is, that's great, but how do we move to the next step and actually instill behavioral change? And I think we're just not quite there yet, but I do think having data show us that we've only walked 300 steps a day does change our perception of who we think we are. So the two projects I want to talk about today, up there is the Withings Activité. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it because it's one of the very less known activity trackers, but the reason I love this one is because from a design perspective, they realize that real estate, your wrists are really finite real estate. So if you're going to do something, you have to make it not only beautiful, but also functional. So the primary function of this is a watch. And if you look at the secondary dial right next to it, that's where the activity tracking is. So the actual technology that's embedded in this, it is wearable tech, watch, timepiece first, and activity tracker second. So they have the hierarchy of needs basically based right, I think, in this really beautiful timepiece. The second one I discovered while I was at CES this year, which is we're moving from thinking about how we're moving throughout the day and our health from just being active or inactive to actually thinking of our health and body connection. So being is an attempt to do mood tracking. So essentially it uses a lot of biosensors to track our heart rate variability and basically to track your moods, to let you know when you're stressed, although generally I think we all know when we're stressed, but also to let you know at least patterns of the days that you become stressed. And again, I haven't played around with this particular wearable because it's not yet on the market, but you know, it's like great mindfulness, but how do we move it to the next step of actually behavioral change? So of course, the need to monitor ourselves extends to monitoring the other people in our immediate close-range family, especially the ones that are vulnerable, which are babies and of course the elderly. So Spratling is an activity tracker for babies because babies can't talk yet. The Spratling is supposed to let you know whether the baby is sleeping well, and you know, monitoring its body temperature, monitoring its sleeping patterns, monitoring its motion, as well as its heart rate. So the next theme here we have is like this whole notion of documenting our lives, journaling, you know, which has existed obviously forever, but also the desire to share that and to try to create some form of legacy. So you know, I think the GoPro is really the pioneer in this space, and it allowed people who are really into extreme sports to document and share their experiences together. But nowadays, the newest comer, I think, is SnapCam. And what SnapCam does is not only a wearable camera, but it will take high definition video, but also will allow you to live stream it. And you know, considering the whole hoorah about Meerkat at South by Southwest, I think these wearable devices are the next stage in our desire to become internet famous. But not only do we project our desire to become internet famous on ourselves, but also on our pets. So we now have this experiment that's happening in Australia. It's the Whiskas wearable camera for your cat, because your cat leads a very adventurous life when you're not with it. Although from all the Instagram photos that your cat has, at least these user testing cats have taken, their lives are kind of boring and they're not very good photographers. So the next theme really is about augmenting my body, making ourselves superhuman. And we've been doing this again forever. We use eyeglasses when our vision is starting to slip. We use hearing aids as a way to augment our hearing. But what we're talking about here is really augmenting our senses to make us superhuman, you know, and we see this theme, of course, in all the comic books around. There's a new, it's basically environmentally, I think it's pronounced ZOA, an environmentally monitoring device that allows you to monitor the toxins in the air, the UV in the air. And what this is really doing is it's making what is invisible to us, we can't see UV light, so it's what is making invisible to us actually visible. And it's allowing you to be a little bit more aware about the air you're breathing, your environment around us. And a place, of course, like in Beijing, where people are constantly pulling out their phone to monitor their air quality outside, this device actually can become incredibly useful and meaningful in that context. The hug shirt I still really love, because what it really is playing on the human emotion is we all want to be in two places, in two locations at once, and we can't. So we're dealing with this whole notion of remote intimacy. Like, how can we share a hug over distance? And if we think about how a technology like FaceTime has allowed distant partners, or a father and children, or mother and children in distant relationships to really become close together, or grandparents with their grandkids, that's allowed that level of intimacy to make them feel like distance really has been, the time, space continuum has really been shrunk. A shirt like the hug shirt really brings in the haptic aspect to it. And of course we have the Express Who I Am, because ultimately fashion, the number one really role is to protect ourselves, but to express who I am. And we're not that far away from this notion of digital clothing. And the idea that we can, using an app, actually change what we're wearing, at least the graphics on it, and download a lot of these images and devices. This is a project that was done by Bounty's TShirt OS. It's called the TShirt OS. It was actually designed and done by the Switch Embassy. And the idea, I think, of programmable clothes is incredibly interesting. I personally don't think it's going to happen with LED lights. I think it's going to happen with inks over time. The idea that we could have a couple of silhouettes and all we were doing is designing and downloading patterns onto our clothing is incredibly interesting and not to mention sustainable. And lastly, these are more utility-based stuff, but it's like alert me with what matters most. So of course we have a lot of noise in the world, because we are becoming more and more connected. So having devices that let us know that what is most important that we could cue into is incredibly important. And I know the Apple Watch hasn't come out yet. It's supposed to do a little bit more than that, but I primarily think it's just gonna alert you with a couple of emails and Twitter feeds. But so the altruist by covert designs is kind of an interesting concept because really it does one thing, and that's just alert you, and it's a ring. It's obviously designed for the female demographic, and it buzzes to let you know that you've got a call, and I think it has patterns of buzzing to let you know depending on who the person is texting or calling you. And lastly, unlock my world and personalize my experience. So the Disney Magic Band, if you're not familiar with it, is really an interesting sort of concept that Disney's been playing around with for 2 years. Essentially, it's a wearable band that allows you to have, it like unlocks your hotel or the entryway in and out of the park if you're wearing it, but also functions, of course, as a way for payments, which again, as we get closer to the smartwatch, our payments, the need for our wallet, we're gonna be able to ditch that, and any level of identification, it's all gonna be present on the wrist. But the interesting part of that isn't just the transactional aspect. It's when Sammy, the 5-year-old, comes up to Elsa, I think she's a princess, right? So Elsa, and she says, well, happy birthday, you're 5 today. And that seems incredibly meaningful to someone like Samantha. But at the end of the day, I mean, it might be meaningful for her and very magical for her, but for the rest of us, adults, it might seem slightly creepy. So there's a lot of needs that you can see are being sort of served, or they're attempting to, a lot of these devices are really attempting to serve very intimate needs, very personal needs. These needs are real. So it's not that a lot of these wearables is a space of hype, but it's the fact that there is something that is missing right now, because most of these wearables to date end up in a drawer after 3 months, and we have data to prove this. You know, we only wear them for 3 months. Once the novelty wears off, it's gone. So what's missing? So I think there's I'm kind of butcher this quote by Yves Behar, but he said something to the extent of like, there's beauty in function and function in beauty, and these are synergistic. You know, it's not either or. It's not a conversation about form over function or function over form. It is both. So, of course, it's really easy to harp on wearables and say that they are ugly because the first generation of them were ugly. And then we try to superficially skin them by either making them pink or turquoise for women or adding a bunch of Swarovski crystals to add a little bit of bling, but that doesn't quite work very well. But there have been really interesting attempts by the tech industry to merge with the fashion industry. And this is the Mica bracelet by Intel. It's a collaboration between Intel and 2 designers from Opening Ceremony. And this really is, if you see it in person, an incredibly beautifully, mindfully designed, thoughtful wearable. So it's primarily a piece of jewelry first, and again, it is pretty much a smart watch on the inside, but some of the UX design is interesting where instead of all the watches that display your private information on top of your wrist, you know, you get to glance and look at the inner side of your wrist, and that I think is incredibly thoughtful from a UX perspective. But even with the Mica, we're not really quite there. And I think the reason is they've done so much to merge the form factor, the aesthetic, the materiality with the actual design of it, is that they actually forgot about the other end, which is the software end. Because if you look on the inside and you see something this ugly, but on the outside it's incredibly beautiful, there's a disconnect here. And I think we need to realize that, like the online and offline world, there's only one world, guys. You know, we all experience the same way. There is no difference from a user experience perspective between hardware and software experience of a product. And what happens often is that these companies that work in silos, the hardware team and the software team, we may be collaborating now with product designers, but all of this equals into a cohesive user experience. And without that, there is a disconnect for the user. And this happens quite often. You look at a lot of these, look at the activity tracking apps. You may have a beautiful activity tracker, but the app at the same time isn't consistent. It might be beautiful in its own right, but the story that it's telling is very inconsistent for the user. So And that ends up resulting is this disjointed experience. We can't necessarily name it, but the fact is that it doesn't entirely feel right. There's something, again, missing in this experience. So I think one company, of course, that I think does it well and is, of course, Nike. Because if you look at that, there's a cohesion there. There's a story there. They chose to edit. So instead of putting every single sensor you can possibly put in an activity tracker, they chose not to track sleep. Why? Because their target audience was 18 to 24 athletes. Athletes don't sleep. They don't need to sleep. Sleep doesn't matter. Sleep tracking is irrelevant, right? So they chose to edit their hardware. It wasn't about everything that they can jam into that fuel band. They also used the word fuel because it wasn't about steps. It wasn't about points. It was really about energy. And their app, the metaphor and the language and the visual design of the app was incredibly cohesive with their physical product design. So I feel like they really created this cohesive world. Plus, Nike's fortunate enough to be able to have an ecosystem, and of other products and other items that you can really immerse yourself into that world if you are the Nike type of athlete. And if you aren't, at least it's aspirational for those who want to be. So my one recommendation and suggestion is to really, when you're designing wearable technology, because it's hard to get the form right, it's hard to get the software right, it's hard to get the hardware right, but you have to have a strong point of view. Really have a strong point of view. As any good filmmaker would say, as any good magazine editor would say, as any good stylist would say, editing is the key to having a strong point of view. So you need to edit. Don't jam every piece of technology and everything into the device. And most importantly, tell a story, have a perspective, have us really want to wear that thing, because again, our bodies have finite real estate, so we really need to want that. We have to make that desirable. So lastly, what I want to continue to say that all these things I've showed you, they're just ideas, right? They're ideas that have been put out into the world. They're not, yes, they're products and we can buy them, but they're going to be obsolete very, very, very quickly. So they're not any different than what we were doing, I would say 8 years ago, when we were experimenting, when we were making and sharing. So as a community, if you're making a wearable, one, first of all, ask whether it should be a wearable versus being an app, because wearables are hard to make. And secondly, just continue to experiment, continue to make, continue to question, and continue to share. And most, I think, importantly, is look on the periphery. Look at what these ladies right up here are doing, because they are really what the future of fashion and technology is. They are pushing these boundaries. They're asking the right questions. They are questioning and making us think of what is to come next. And with that, I think I'm going to conclude. All right, thank you.